many people have seen Dr. Jeff Meldrum on television before? Man, this guy's more famous than Brad Pitt. Yeah, never looking to. Oh yeah, that's much smarter. Remember, these shows want the foremost unarguable authority on the subject. This is who they call Dr. Jeff Meldrum. He got his PhD from SUNY, State University of New York in Stony Brook. He's now professor at Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho. And you've seen him on television a million times. Please give a massive round of applause for our headliner, Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Hard to get up here. Keep private place those up.
All right. Well, first, before I get started, I want to be sure to extend my gratitude to all of you for all of your expressions of support and prayers. Those of you that know I had a bit of a snafu on the Alaskan cruise about a year ago and nearly punched my ticket. So I'm glad to still be here to have the opportunity to continue to share this fascinating mystery with you. So this is a topic, and I know I've crossed paths with some of you at previous events recently, and obviously I can't have a novel presentation for each and every event, and so a recurring theme has been the Patterson-Gimlin film. This is in part because of late there's been a number of snipes taken at the film by various skeptics, but also it's very timely. Yesterday was Bob Gimlin's birthday. He just turned 93. And next week I'll be in Yakima. There'll be an event there to commemorate his birthday, and also I'm not sure the number. We're up to like 57, the 57th anniversary of the Patterson-Gimlin film. So I thought it good to revisit this, and there's enough new folks that are somewhat novice to this topic, as exemplified by the number of books that go flying off the table. I'm always gratified by the fact that represents that many more people that are becoming interested and involved in this fascinating topic, as I said. That I think this will be some interesting new information for you. All right, now I just got to make sure I push the right one. So you've probably all seen various iterations of the Patterson-Gimlin film, whether on documentaries, in which case it's oftentimes a very poor rendition. Mrs. Patterson typically licenses a copy of the film, but it's as I understand it, it's an aged VHS. How many still remember VHS? Copy of the film that has become quite degraded. And the networks don't mind, and they don't like the high price that her lawyer charges for use of the film, but they don't mind the kind of campy, scratchy, faded, poor image that kind of gives it the Blair Witch effect. But you don't appreciate the quality, and it has led to comments like one of my colleagues made the comment, fellow anthropologist who had done actually some analysis of the film and had published on it, made the comment that there is so little detail in there, it's really worthless, he says. You can't even see facial detail. Well, I beg to differ. I think we'll show you some examples. There have been some other really nice renditions. I'm going to talk about one that I was involved in the culmination of, but the resulting file's too big to put into a PowerPoint. But this is one from the internet that's done quite nicely. And the film speed is much closer to the appropriate. For so many years, they always played it at 22 frames per second, because that was the preferred film frame rate for broadcast filming. Fast enough that you got a nice smooth image. It didn't look like an old-fashioned Keystone Cops movie, with the herky-jerky movements. But the film, it's been quite conclusively determined, was not shot at 22 frames per second. It was somewhere between 16 and 18 frames per second. And there is that potential for variance in the performance of this make and model of camera, even though the snap dial stops at 18 frames per second, not 16. But the analysis of the physics involved suggested it was 16 frames per second. That's absolutely within the limitations of the specs of the camera as published. At that frame speed, I wanted to point out, you get a much better sense of the inertia, the mass of that creature, and that heavy arm swing, very relaxed arm swing, as she's striding quite purposely across that sandbar, retreating rapidly from the approach of Roger and Bob. It's just kind of mesmerizing to watch it like that. All right. Now, for me, this all started back in 1969. I was a youngster attending Indian Trail Elementary. I had the pleasure of meeting up with one of my childhood buddies, who was my mother was the den leader for many, many years. When we were Boy Scouts, it's funny because that wasn't too long ago that one of the group had posted a snapshot of us a few years later when we were in Boy Scouts. And Mike was in this shot, and I was there, and several other people that our paths have crossed now and again in college and subsequently and at various reunions and other occasions. It turns out he was at the showing of the film too. Whether it was the same hour, I'm not sure. There were two or three showings that day. But the kids, I was at school, and the kids were all abuzz. We were at a program, and we were waiting in our room for our chance to go out and do our performance for the parents that evening. And the kids were talking about this film that was coming to town, depicting Bigfoot. And I had never heard of Bigfoot. This was new, completely new to me. But I, at that age, was already extremely interested in all things prehistoric, dinosaurs and cavemen and Ice Age megafauna and all the mysteries, natural history mysteries around the world. And so I was all on the edge of my seat, all ears, listening to this. And so after the program, my parents had already left after our class had performed. And so in the dark, I was running in amongst these gigantic ponderosa pine trees, which you have good examples around here. And of course, I just imagined that behind every tree trunk was going to be a Sasquatch. So it was only 2.5 blocks, but it was the longest 2.5 blocks, I think. And raced home, grabbed the paper, opened it up, and here's the advertisement. And subsequently, after describing this experience, someone actually sent me a copy of that advertisement. It was in the Spokesman Review, I think it was the title of the paper. So I convinced my dad we had to go to this. So he and I, and along with my younger brother, went, and we were, well, before I go there, it wasn't too long after this that Harry and the Hendersons came out. I can't remember the year. But when that show came out, my mom was just aghast. She goes, "Jeff, that's you!" Little Ernie Henderson, right down to the cowlick and everything, you know. It was like, it must have been faded, you know. It was in the stars. But I actually found a picture of the Spokane Coliseum in an archival file there. And I don't know if this was the event, but it was just like that. Roger came walking out onto the stage from behind the curtain, from the side of the stage. And my dad and my brother and I were in the center section, 3rd row there, right, just with the screen, this huge, oversized screen behind that curtain, bigger than life, to see this documentary, which showcased that historic 60 seconds of film footage. And so I didn't get the opportunity to meet Roger, but he came out and briefly introduced what we were about to see, and then came out afterwards and fielded a few questions. But then also, upon leaving the Coliseum, we were given a handout of a sample newsletter and an application for membership in the Northwest Research Association. This was Roger's attempt to create an organization that would generate a subscription revenue flow to help underwrite his exploits in the field, his search for this mysterious creature. And membership had some perks, which included a 11 by 14 black and white print. And now remember, these prints are from the original film, the original imagery there. A 5 by 7 color, oh, I keep doing that, sorry. 5 by 7 color print, a close-up of Patty. And then, of course, you could purchase his book. And also, members could buy replica footprint casts, which included this 1963 track that Roger cast on Bluff Creek near the film site, but not at the film site, but 4 years earlier. This isn't Patty. This represents a big 16 to 17 inch, well, 16 inch footprint, which is much broader than Patty's footprint. I think it represents the big male that was in that area. And his tracks were found. This is, in fact, is the same footprint, or the footprint of the same individual who left tracks that were documented by Jerry Crew in 1958. So his tracks were popping up off and on under various circumstances and discovered by various witnesses over a couple of decades during that time period. So it's interesting because in all my talking about this, anyone in this room who was a member of the Northwest Research Association? Yeah, that's been the story. Roger passed away from leukemia just a couple of years later. I don't think the organization really ever got off the ground. I don't remember getting more than one or maybe two newsletters. But in all my talking, I've only met indirectly. Actually, it was at a yard sale, purchasing someone else had purchased it and they gave it to me. It was an old briefcase, and in the briefcase was a replica of Patty's footprint and a couple of snapshots of Roger, just promo pictures of Roger, like the ones you saw. And a certificate for membership of this individual whose estate sale liquidated his Sasquatch holdings. A membership certificate to the Northwest Research Association. So, and in all my travels, I'm the only one that I know of who has one of these casts. So the replicas, those of you who got that replica, it's traces back to apparently a singular example. No one else has stepped forward and said, oh, I have one of those, It was made with a very, an acrylic material, and it's a very nice replica of a cast that Roger made, which is featured prominently if you're interested in his book. All right, well, moving along, we'll come back. The significance of that picture, though, I want to emphasize later on. Of course, I had just a very brief, indirect introduction to Roger, but I've had the good fortune of spending considerable time with Bob Gimlin. And I'm sure a number of you in the room have as well, and you'll agree with me that you can't spend 5 minutes with this guy and not be absolutely confident that he's the salt of the earth. He's just the straightest arrow that there's ever been, and just a really nice guy. Actually my fondest memories, besides hearing him tell his story, meeting him for the first time, was we both spoke at a program. It was called Sasquatch, the Sightings, or the Stories, the Sightings, and the Science. And they had a native storyteller representing the stories. They had Bob representing the sighting, and then they had me representing the science. And he and I were staying together in a hotel, and so for a couple of days took our meals together and so forth. And we didn't talk about Sasquatch at all. We talked about our family and our kids and jobs we've had and where we've lived and yada yada yada. Just the common things you talk about. It was just the most down to earth guy. He wasn't bending my arm. You gotta believe. No, nothing like that. It was just very down to earth. So that speaks, I think, volumes for the credibility when you compare his character to that of others who have made disclaimers and prejudicial comments. So, all right. So here is a high-resolution scan of that 5 by 7 color print, photographic print, that was obviously made from the original master film. Now, you look at that and you tell me, oh, I can't see any facial details. And I'll say, you need to go have your eyes examined. I mean, you can see the heavy brow ridge, the sloping forehead. You can see the light shining off the nose, the shadow beneath a hooded nose, either with slightly forward-directed nostrils or slightly down. You can't really quite resolve that. There's a pouting of the upper lip. It's like if you've ever seen a chimpanzee do this compressed lip display, when they're real tense, they'll press their lip at the top when they have a very muscular mouth, and the orbicularis is well developed, and they'll pooch out, puff out. There you can see it. You can see the chinless lower jaw, the flaring gonial angle, the shadow of the very thick masseter muscle. You can see the high, wide cheekbones that are catching the light there. You know, for someone to say, oh look, you can see it's a mask and the eye is cut out so you can see out of it. That's the glint of the sun off the hairless skin over the nose and the upper part of the cheek below the eye. It's just, there's lots and lots of anatomy there to be seen. Okay, we'll come back to more of that later. I wondered, for a long time I wondered, if they had made those prints from the original film, why would you stop with just one frame? Why wouldn't you make more? Well, it turns out that they did. And they did make a brief appearance. If you're familiar with the Argosy magazine article or the National Wildlife, yell at me if I keep standing right in front of you, you can't see the National Wildlife magazine article had these in very small scale and you know, not very useful or informative. But copies of these languished in a safe apparently for years and years, and eventually came to light. And Chris Murphy did a lot to promote them. They first were published in the book Man Like Monsters on Trial, which was an edited volume of some of the papers presented at a conference on Bigfoot at the University of British Columbia. One of the first serious academic conferences on this topic. But there was politics in it, but we won't get into that. And subsequently, Chris Murphy again did some more work on these images. But here they are. Here are the high-resolution files, high-definition files that he has shared with me, and you can see all sorts of things. I mean, this is, at this point, this is very early, at the beginning of the encounter, when Roger had his horse had fallen on its side. He extricated his camera as expeditiously as he could and ran across the creek bed, yelling to Bob to cover him. Bob rode across the creek on his horseback, pulled his .30-06 from the scabbard, and dismounted, clutching tenaciously to the reins. He said he didn't want that horse to get away because the pack horse had already pulled loose from him and run and bolted downstream. And so initially she was just on the other side of the creek. In fact, you can see her tracks going up the sandbar onto the edge of the creek, probably just before they got there. And then she began to stride, like I said, very purposefully away from him. But you know, you notice, look at this intermediate but relatively high compared to a human attachment of the trapezius muscle. It's broad shoulders. You can actually see as she's moving, you'll watch for the shoulder blades slide under the skin there. You can see the massive erector spinae muscles, these two columns right here. Then they come down and they end right at the edge of the iliac crest, the pelvic bone. You can see well-defined buttocks, the gluteus maximus. And you can see the native cleft. We'll draw attention to that a little more detail later on. Look at the size of those hands. I mean, they're big baseball mitts, long arms from the shoulder down. You can see why some people say, even though later in some of the shots they don't look like they're that long, but you can see if someone had just glimpsed her from this perspective for a brief time, they'd say her hands almost came down to her knees. Because she's so crouched, the supporting limb is very bent, and this limb is flexed and raised to clear that foot because of the flexed nature of her other limb. And so the hands are quite low. You can see the plantar surface of the foot quite well. In fact, so well, on enlargement, you can actually see the individual toe pads quite clearly. There's no question that foot, whatever it is at this point, we'll just offer that caveat, whatever it is responsible for the tracks that were cast subsequently at the spot on that day by Roger Patterson. Here's another one. Now the other foot. Now this one shows a problem that has tripped up people. And that is that the foot now is elevated to a point that the orientation of the sole of the foot is catching the afternoon sun, and it's bouncing it back to the camera lens and overexposing that flat, hairless surface, that kind of smooth surface. And when it's overexposed, it gains a halo. It has a fuzzy edge. It's not nice and crisp. And so it gives a very false image, or impression rather, a false impression of the actual proportions of the foot. And you can see how also it appears that exaggerated by that puffiness, the extension of the heel looks like beyond the Achilles tendon, the calcaneal tendon on the back of the foot. So the critics say, well, that's obviously, the false foot is extending past the actor's foot. Well, no, it's just that at that position of the swing phase of the foot, the non-supported foot, the tendon of the flexors of the ankle are relaxed. And the distance between the tendon and the tibia is exaggerated in this creature compared to us because their heel is much longer to provide increased leverage for her larger body mass. So when it's slack, it makes the heel look much more prominent than it would in a human foot. But the real problem of this has been using this, and we'll touch on this if time permits at the very end, as a scale, because it exaggerates the length of the foot, and so you can't fit as many of them if you're using it as a scale to estimate height. And then there's some other factors we'll talk about, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's one. Now look, you can see that massive arm. Again, you can see the pronounced buttocks. Now, for a long time, I was a little equivocal. Is that fatty tissue? Is that muscle or what? I'm going to argue that it's largely muscle. There might be a little bit of adipose, a little saddlebagging going on the side there, but the gluteus maximus is well pronounced, and we'll see some images to illustrate that. Here you can really see the very natural looking continuity of the trapezius up the back of the skull. There's no pencil neck there, massive traps, and flaring out to these extremely broad shoulders, which we can't appreciate yet because of the angle. But the estimate of her shoulder breadth, she, we'll find out, comes out to about 6'8". So I'm 6 foot, my shoulders are 24 inches across. I have fairly broad shoulders. But her shoulders are 36 inches across, and standing at 6'8". So she is big, and she's as deep from front to back as she is almost from side to side. Not the shoulder breadth, but the chest breadth under the arms. So let's move on. Otherwise, we're gonna. Now here you can start to see her head's rotating. We're not quite a full profile yet. We're kind of looking a little bit behind because the ear is way too close to the front there. If that were a true profile. But you can see there's no forehead. It goes right back from her brow ridges to the peak at the back of the head, the deep set eyes, the sunken eyes, the prominent cheek, which especially from this angle is accentuated, and the vertical face. There's no prognathic jaws. It's quite vertical. And then she starts to turn. We see that she's a female with low set breasts, very prominent. There's a little bit of a Dunlop here, where the belly Dunlop over the belt. A common occurrence postpartum, but it takes a little while for that slack skin to tighten back up, and so it's hanging. And this strikes me as postpartum engorgement. That she's lactating, and you can see the pec muscle here. You can see when she swings her arm, there's a little fold of skin at the axilla, at the beginning of the armpit. And the breast tissue, she's probably in her golden years, a little elderly. The adipose tissue is hanging a little lower, and you can see the pectoralis major muscle quite clearly. And anyway, we could go on. And this is the point that I'm making: is there's so much anatomy here. to make the comment, oh, this is worthless, it can't see anything. There is so much that can be seen. It's just uncanny. It is right before the tail end. Now, if you want to see these and study them on your own, again, another plug for those who reiterated for those who were here last night for the relic hominoid inquiry. A number of you stopped by and asked for the sticker, but there's the URL. It's quite easy to remember. It's just the ISU web server and then the acronym RHI for relic hominoid inquiry. And Chris Murphy did a nice little descriptive paper, and we have high resolution and large scale files of each of these images that you can download and examine on your computer, study to your heart's content. I encourage you to do that. And in the RHI, you'll find many other papers that are pertinent to a study of the Patterson-Gimlin film, some that I have contributed to, and also reviews of other papers and other books and so on. Lots of interesting material. This is just a sample of some of the papers that are available there. Now, let's dispel a misnomer that gets perpetuated time and time again, and that is, the film is not blurry. Those of you in the back, can you read that? I don't get it. No matter how many photos I take, you keep coming out blurry and indistinguishable. There was actually someone who made the comment on Facebook, one of the Facebook posts, of this recent spat of attention, viral attention to the costumed actor sitting under the tree, you know, playing with the branch of leaves. And one of the comments, I just loved it. It said, oh, I knew right from the start that it was fake because it wasn't out of focus. Well, the film is in focus. It was shot with a camera that had a lens that was a fixed focal length lens. Now, some of you in the room will remember, back in the day, the Kodak Instamatic point and shoot, you didn't have to mess around with a dial to focus it, because anything from 2 feet to infinity was in focus. And that's the way this camera was that Roger had. And so what we get is motion blur, though. He's running and the camera's going around here and there, and that combined with, although to our good fortune, as he went running across the creek with this camera up to his eye and his other eye closed. You know what it's like when you look through an old-fashioned viewfinder. Not many, some of you may not have ever had that experience, you know, with an iPhone is your only source of photography. But for those of you who can remember, it was like looking through a telescope backwards, right? The image was this little tiny thing at the end of a dark tunnel. And so imagine Roger running after it, trying to stay focused on this, or not focused, but say centered on this subject. And he ran into this 3-foot sandbar. The creek had cut down through the sandbar, and so there was a 3-foot rise, a lip, and he ran right into it, and it knocked him to his knees. Thankfully, because then he held still, and he panned right along with it, and that's where we get that really great sequence in the shot. So, but the point is, he's still some distance away, so the film was shot on 16 millimeter film. Excuse me a second. The subject was a mere 1.8 millimeters in height, and we're blowing it up here to project on the wall of an auditorium. And that exceeds the ability of the resolution of the grain of the film. The grain of the film. What in the world do I mean by grain of the film? Well, in this digital age, we're talking pixels, right? Little discrete packets of data, and they're very easy to copy because we can digitally copy those discrete packets of information with high degree of reliability and fidelity. But if the original image is of low resolution, has fewer pixels, when you blow them up, when you enlarge those individual pixels, the picture becomes pixelated. Well, in the old days with photographic film, we had a plastic platen, a film, what's the word about base, and then a chemical laced emulsion that is applied to that plastic base, and it contains photosensitive chemicals. And they were in the form of individual crystals all packed together in here that were sensitive to light. And this was called the grain of the film, the texture of the crystals. You could have a film that was that required a lot of light. There was daylight, bright daylight conditions were ideal in order to expose all of these crystals and get very high resolution. But you couldn't use that film in the wee hours of the evening or nighttime. You needed something with a much larger grain, but then your images would be a little grainier. They'd be more pixelated, in other words, kind of, to use the term. Okay? Now, the consequence of that is, whenever you make a copy, instead of digitally replicating the discrete packets of digital information, you would have to literally put another piece of film against the negative or the internegative, if you're projecting from a positive film. And those crystals don't line up precisely with one another like pixels would. And so it introduces little artifacts, little edge features and smudges and so forth. The copy is never as good as the original. And each time you copy a copy, you introduce more of those artifacts. So it loses its resolution. That's why it's very disappointing that the original film of the Patterson-Gimlin film is lost. And all we have are a few first-generation copies, and then the descendants, if you will, the pedigree downstream of those. All right, now this leads to one of the most recent, and I think best analysis of the film that has been conducted. And you can watch it on, the proof is out there on the History Channel, season 2, episode 13. There's a URL. If you just Google the proof is out there, Patterson-Gimlin film, Meldrum, Munns, and Tien, it'll come up. You'll find it. Okay, and what we did for this, they were interested in re-examining the Patterson-Gimlin film when they heard about what we had been working on. And what that involved, here's the team. Bill Munns, for those of you who don't know who he was in the Hollywood creature effects industry for about 28 years. And he's also a fantastic forensic anthropological artist, does all kinds of reconstruction of both extinct and extant species of primate and hominin. He also is quite the aficionado when it comes to the history of cinematography in terms of cameras and film, the logistical, mechanistic aspects of cinematography. And so his perspectives on the film are multifaceted. He really is. One of the things he's done is try to accumulate as many copies of the film as he could and establish their position in the genealogy of generational copies. I've been able to contribute 3 or 4 copies that I have come upon from various sources to that data set. But he has about a dozen or more. And what he's done then is taken each frame from those copies that he's studied, noted all the markings and any splicing and so forth. And he has done high-resolution digital photographs. So he's converted the film frame into a digital image that can be manipulated in the computer. Or not manipulated, examined in the computer. Then we linked up with Isaac Tien, who is a recently minted PhD from the University of Washington in computer vision. And he got interested in this topic and this project, and he's been working with Bill and I. And he, what he did is wrote algorithms that would allow him to identify very precisely specific landmarks in each of the film frames, and then superimpose each copy of individual frames, stack them up upon one another. And in so doing, that allowed him, so here's the precise alignments, that allowed us to identify what were individual artifacts, idiosyncrasies of a particular copy or latent missing data from a washed out, degraded frame or something like that, versus the outliers. The idiosyncrasies were the outliers, and versus the consistent imagery of the actual film that better approximates the original. By stacking those up then, superimposing them, it washes out the rare variables and emphasizes the consistent features, and you end up with an image that is about as close to the original film frame as you can get. I mean, it is as close as you can get, almost there. And it also, in the process, also eliminates the individual copy flecks of dust and scratches and so forth. So you have a richer, fuller, more vibrant and cleaner, with sharper edges result than ever available before. And just to show you how impressive this was, I don't mean to say there were any marvelous revelations. To those of us who had studied the film carefully, what it did is it just emphasized the things that we had already observed. But it made it possible to point them out, to demonstrate them for the less versed audience, less aware of the underlying anatomy and such. But I was going to say, the episode of The Proof Is Out There, they have a couple resident skeptics that they turn to for their opinions, critical opinions of the evidence that was examined. And I got this phone call out of the blue from the producer, who I've gotten to know quite well, and I've worked with him as an expert evaluator on a number of different films that they've examined. If you've watched this episode or this series, you've seen me pop up here and again, sometimes in weird places that I was a little uneasy about offering an opinion of, but they've treated me very well, and it's been a really interesting process. But one of these resident skeptics was known to be quite the curmudgeon, and he was very skeptical about Sasquatch, very, very skeptical. And so the producer calls me, says, I just got off the phone with, his name is escaped me. This is off the cuff, this part right now. But he said, he explained to me who this gentleman was, and he's actually a PhD in ecological sciences. He specializes in ornithology, does work down in Central and South America, but he does this for fun. And his response was, wow, you're really making it hard for me to remain skeptical. He just had never even thought that this film had that kind of potential content. And he was just blown away. He was just mesmerized by it. And he made comments, in fact, so much so, and I was so eager to follow through, I reached out to him and said, hey, Miguel shared with me what you had said, and I was just wondering, I have this journal. I would really love if you would provide a commentary about your reaction to this, just as kind of a guest editorial. And he agreed and wrote a very thoughtful one. He sort of backed up a little bit with his enthusiasm and tempered it somewhat, but still closed with this strong admonition to the scientific community that, hey, there could be more to this than we've given due credit, should take a closer look. Anyway, so we'll talk about this image a little bit more later on. So with that sort of prefatory setting the stage, the theme that I want to present to you is the notion that science is finally catching up to the evidence of Sasquatch. That is, if we look at this film, which was shot in 1967, it actually anticipated many interesting combinations of traits or individual features that at the time, according to the conventional wisdom of anthropology, were completely counterintuitive. They just didn't make any sense. And therefore, it must be a hoax. It couldn't exist. And yet, now, decades later, those very oddities, perceived oddities, turn out to be precisely how we envisioned early bipedal hominids to have appeared. All right, and so here's just a small sampling, and we won't even be able to touch on all of these given the time limits, but the mosaic of a small brain in bipedalism, the retention of midfoot flexibility with a non-divergent phalanx, deep jaws with flat face, non-projecting canines in the absence of tools. Now, what does that mean? Well, the mosaic of small brain bipedalism, for the longest time there was a debate in anthropology. Which came first? It was the proverbial chicken or the egg argument. Did big brains lead out, or did bipedalism lead out? In other words, did our brains get bigger, which prompted us to use our hands to explore environment, manipulate, and make tools, therefore requiring us to free the hands? Or did our posture and locomotion in the trees predispose us to more upright posture and more dexterous hands and divergent thumbs so that we could manipulate and hold objects, which then selected for bigger brains so we could do that more effectively and efficiently? I mean, it's kind of like a merry-go-round, isn't it? It just depends on where you're going to jump on to the merry-go-round. But the established conventional wisdom, us egocentric species that we are, it was the brains that led out. So big brains came before the advent of bipedalism, right? That was the thought. And of course, the Piltdown man, that hoax, was more readily accepted in light of that attitude because, not only was it big brains leading out over bipedalism, but it was an Englishman. So, retention of midfoot flexibility. We'll talk about this in terms of the metatarsal break, the lack of a rigid longitudinal arch, but the possession of a non-divergent big toe. Instead of sticking like a thumb, the toe was lined up with the others. But wait, there are those who would say that the big toe only became less divergent, non-divergent, when it was incorporated into the longitudinal arch that created the stable platform of the fully formed bipedal hominid. Okay, we'll talk about that. Deep jaws with a flat face. Well, a flat face only occurred with the reduction of the size of the jaws and the diminution of the teeth. They got smaller and smaller and the lack of projecting canine. It seemed counterintuitive that you would have a flat face, but these massive, deep jaws and hypermolar, premolar teeth with hyper-thick enamel. Non-projecting canines in the absence of tools. It was thought that hominin canines got smaller and smaller as we became more and more dependent on stone tools. If you had a knife in your hand, you didn't have to carry one around in your mouth. Okay. Well, it turns out there are other reasons to reduce the size of the canine. So let's look at one of these in particular. Let's take the first one. And to illustrate this, we're going to turn to John Napier. This is an interesting character. He was a primatologist, British primatologist at the Smithsonian Institute. And he was also a member of the scientific panel that were the first American scientists to view the Patterson-Gimlin film. He was probably amongst the most open-minded. He was so intrigued by the whole topic that a few years later he published a book on Bigfoot and the question of evolved snowman or Yeti, in which he actually concluded that he was convinced that Sasquatch exists. He said, after all, something is leaving those footprints. Whether it's all that it's cracked up to be remains to be seen. But when it came to the Patterson-Gimlin film and his viewing on the panel, and subsequently he was thumbs down, he was negative on that. But he acknowledged that there really wasn't anything in particular he could put his finger on to justify that rejection, except that he said that the upper half of the body bears some resemblance to an ape, and the lower half is typically human. It's almost impossible to conceive that such hybrids could exist in nature. One half of the animal must be artificial. In other words, the whole thing is artificial. So this is the red flag for him. This combination just couldn't exist. Because remember, think about it. See, in part, he was also influenced by the notion that big brains let out. So to have a creature that had the brain the size of an ape but with this remarkably human-like configuration of the lower extremities. That just didn't make any sense. That couldn't possibly, that was inconceivable, right? You keep using that word, I do not think it means what you think it means. So, it's ironic that literally a few years after his book came out, came the announcements of the discoveries of these early Australopithecines from East Africa, Australopithecus afarensis, or more commonly known as Lucy. And how did they describe her to the popular press? Well, for the first time we had now associated cranial remains and well-preserved hip bones, pelvis, the knee, the femur, the angled inward femur, the ankles, and so forth, the non-divergent big toe. Well, the scientist said to the press, "Isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks essentially like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, she looks like a little human." Well, now wait a minute. That was the very linchpin of nature's rejection of the Patterson-Gimlin film. What if, I wonder, and I've looked for other commentary or other publications by him. Unfortunately, I think his health began to flag shortly after that time period. And he seemed to stick to his original conclusion in the book, his skepticism about the Patterson-Gimlin film. But you have to wonder what he would think about that after these discoveries and these announcements were made. All right, so it's interesting that what we see on the film is exactly how we now conceive of the unusual, unexpected combination of traits depicted in the early Australopithecines, with the exception of the large size and the Pleistocene gigantism that Bigfoot seems to reflect. But this is a reconstruction of a robust Australopithecine, Paranthropus boisei, from East Africa, that was carried out by Ray Matamus, an excellent, very accomplished anthropological forensic illustrator. Is that giving a feedback? Is that because I'm standing in front of the speaker?
I think it's just my brain.
Okay. All right. Kind of looks familiar though, doesn't it? Like you hear a lot of stories about Sasquatch throwing rocks, eating stones at fishermen and so forth, you know? Maybe not obviously the social organization there, but still, I could, if I was writing an introductory text in anthropology, and I needed an illustration of a robust Australopithecine, if we could ignore the scale, and there wasn't the stigma and the context associated with this image, I could plug it in to that chapter, and it would suit my purpose just fine, to illustrate what we think a robust Australopithecine probably looked like. So, I know that I haven't watched, since we've been empty nesters for quite some time, Sesame Street, which you all know, probably most of you know the little jingle. I think it's probably politically incorrect. We don't use it anymore since Sesame Street's probably pretty woke by this point. But I had fun finding these images, you know, so we can ask the question, one of these things is not like the other, one of these things just doesn't belong. Can you tell me which one is not like the other? Tell me now before something is done. But you can see how Dr. Napier who was very familiar with ape anatomy and was also a specialist in primate locomotion. He was kind of the father of the category system that we still build much of our discussions about primate locomotor behaviors and anatomies upon. And so looking at this, he would immediately notice the difference, you know, the obvious difference in the pelvic structure and the relative proportions of the lower extremities and so forth. But other than that, and sometimes our perceptions, you know, are biased by our preoccupations, what we're most concerned about. But otherwise, in every other regard, I mean, you know, you look at Patrick over here, and you know, there's no question that this falls into this category. It would lump in with that box, I would think. And you can see. All right, here's the bonus question. Mugato, you got it right off the bat. All right, but look at that pelvis. Whoops, we go ahead one. Oh, shucks. I wonder if I've got the right version. There's supposed to be another picture down here, but that's all right. So we'll make do. That's what happens. I make edits and I shift them here and there, and then sometimes I end up with the same with the old version. But you can see the configuration of the pelvis. I had a gorilla squatting in almost the same posture, and the difference in the pelvic structure was really, really obvious. You can also, this is a little washed out with this screen, but there's such a visible seam around the shoulder right here. I mean, it's just so obvious. And yet, and guess who? Here's another. This is the triple bonus, daily double or whatever, daily triple. Who is in the costume? Yes, you got it. Janos Prohaska. Remember the interview when Janos was in the orangutan costume and his wife takes the head off and the mask off, and then he's interviewed and he talks about his reactions, and he says it would have to be, hair would have to be glued directly to the skin of the actor. He said, and that would take at least 8 hours. He said, if this is a hoax, it is the best hoax that I've ever seen. Well, Bill Munns points out that technique of gluing the hair directly to the actor's skin was only done once on the silver screen, and that was in the movie Altered States with William Hurt. If you go back and look, when he supposedly externalizes as an early hominid and comes climbing out of the isolation tank, goes running amok and kills the goats in the zoo. Well, you can see that was the best effort at gluing hair directly, and it was this short, skinny actor that was supposed to represent, their idea of what an Australopithecine would look like, because that was what he had reverted to, genetic memory of his ancestors. So, great, that was excellent. All right, so here we have a contrast, and this shows what I would have shown you with that inset. The shortened iliac blade, much more bowl-like in shape than the striking elongated and fore and aft-facing blades of the pelvis. And I'm not going to go into all the anatomy, but look at the effect it has on the appearance of the gluteus maximus. The attachments of the gluteus maximus are brought closer together, so the muscle belly bunches up with this, tight bun here, you could say. And then wrapping around here is the gluteus medius that helps to balance over the bipedal limbs, because we lift one limb off the ground, so we have to teeter our pelvis over one support. If you're walking quadrupedally like a mugatu or like an ape, gorilla, you have your forelimbs involved too. So all of the hip muscles are utilized for retraction of the hip, extension of the hip socket, hip joint, rather than balancing the pelvis in side to side. How many of you have ever seen someone who has suffered a paralysis of the gluteus muscles, especially the gluteus medius? They're not capable of balancing quite as well, and so they look like a tightrope walker, kind of, because they have to throw their body weight to the affected side to prevent the pelvis from dropping down. And so you see someone who walks like this, that's called the Trendelenburg sign, and that indicates, well, how do chimpanzees walk? Yeah, exactly, especially when you see an actor exaggerate trying to mimic. Well, what are they doing? They're using their arms like a person would use a balancing rod on a tightrope to shift their center of mass so they don't fall off. All right, so the Sasquatch is clearly adapted as a biped. It's not a costume that is intended to try to mimic grade 8 anatomy or behavior at all. Now, here's a fun little thing. When Roger went running across the stream, the creek, Bluff Creek, the camera is gyrating with his steps as he's running. And so, of course, you rarely see this on TV. Every once in a while they'll show it. It's quite dramatic. It's going all over the place, but every once in a while, there's one frame right there where the camera, the frame captures a nice shot of Patty as she's retreating. And we have more of a posterior view than a 3/4 or lateral view. Look at that up close, and what do you notice? There's a butt crack, right? As to be anatomically appropriate, that is the natal cleft. The natal cleft. There it is, but what do you also notice these nice tight cheeks right there. Boom. And see, you can see there's the erector spinae. Remember we talked about the erector spinae coming down and a buddy with the pelvis? Well, that's a kind of tall blade, but it's not nearly as long as it is in the gorilla. Here's another frame of Patty, and this one is slightly, I think this is just grayscale. But you can see, is that hairless skin over the butt cheeks? Some have described it as being kind of sparsely haired back there. But, again, go back to the Harry and the Hendersons. What's missing from this picture? The butt crack. He's wearing trousers. There's just nothing. In fact, in this one, it almost looks like there's a little tail there. Or maybe he didn't make it to the restroom fast enough. But, what a difference between these two. And it's interesting to look at the sole of the foot, the relative proportions. It's all kind of interesting. Now here, you can see the clear affinity of that anatomy to that of a human, as opposed to, this is Ambam. Ambam is a gorilla at the London Zoo, and he really likes to stand upright and walk bipedally. He just does it. He wasn't trained that way. They didn't encourage it, but he just seems to prefer it. Stand and look around and go walk, not even carrying anything. But again, look at the anatomy. Those tall iliac blades. You can see the erector spinae. They're kind of obscured by the slack skin folds there. He's a fully mature, aging. But you can see the gluteus maximus starts right about there and comes down, and it inserts down here, but it's a little bit obscured below by the tufts of hair. Now this guy's a little bit doughy, so he doesn't really serve our purposes really well. So here now look at that. There's some muscle development. But see, I'm really, not to be facetious, but look at that. Look at the configuration of the gluteus maximus. See, if I highlight it there, and the difference, and look at the spacing here between the top of the gluteus maximus and the iliac crest. It's not exactly human, but we wouldn't expect it to be exactly human. It's not a human. Let me say that again. It's not a human. Okay? All right. Now, what do you see? Butt cheeks, that's right. Paul Freeman pulled this out of the drawer or box and shows it to me, and you've got to be kidding. And he goes, he holds it this way, he holds it this way. He says, I'm not sure which way it goes. He said that he followed 15-inch tracks in the sand, and in the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla, we have a massive deposit of glacial loess. It's this silty, fine, talcum powdery soil that was pulverized by the Ice Age, by the glaciers during the Ice Age. And it's massive deposits, wind-blown deposits across western Washington and down across southwestern and all the way over into eastern Idaho. And so the soil, when it's exposed, is very powdery. I mean, it's like if you've been on a logging road, Forest Service road that has lots of traffic and the dirt is just pulverized. It's like that, but for meters thick in places. The deposits are just massive. So where in the blues they have created tertiary roads that are just graded roads that are not improved with any gravel bed, they are amazing track beds. Anything that crosses or walks along the shoulder leaves fantastic footprints, whether in the dry, dusty soil or during the spring and the fall, the rains and the melt water. It turns into a very clayey soil and holds the shape very fine, very well, fine detail. This is the place where the first examples of dramatic lithops were discovered. And this is why, because it would hold that fine detail, and then as long as the casting was done carefully enough, it would transfer to the plaster. So I started looking at it. I was done with my little chortle, and I looked and I go, well, my goodness, that's a tailbone. That's the coccyx right there. Okay, you can see the cheeks right here. That is a sphincter, right where it should be, under the coccyx. Sort of inconspicuous external genitalia. I suspect it's probably a female, but females of a Sasquatch. This is what's funny. See, here's this reminds me of another story. When that panel at the Smithsonian all came out, how silly. What a silly film to show us, waste our time. And they had to justify their rejection because it didn't fit their paradigm. So what did they say? Well, Nate gave his comment. There was another professor who looked and he said, well, look, they ridiculously added breasts for effect, and yet it clearly walks like a man. It's a man in a fursuit. Well, why do human males and females walk differently than one another on average? The pelvic dimensions due to obstetric concerns, the birth canal. The birth canal enlargement literally puts the hip bones further apart. I'm sorry, the hip joints further apart. And just as I said, we have this tendency to tilt when support is over a single limb. In the ladies, that tilt is exaggerated due to the greater distance. So when they walk, there's more. Isn't that wonderful, guys? That byproduct of, well, the reason why do the guys like that so much? Because that indicates that this woman has a nice sized birth canal and will deliver healthy babies. This is all programmed, see? So nature has made that very attractive so that the males will be attracted to those women who are most likely to have the most successful birth experience. So, now, see, there's a purpose for all this. You don't have to apologize for it. You just have to, be mature. And how does that song go? Enjoy. That Frenchman. All right. So, here, let's just go ahead. Oh, what's interesting though is when you get the light just right, and I didn't. I should have taken another picture with a strong side light. Whoop! But you can see hair streaming across the cheeks here towards the cleft, and the cleft is very smooth. This area here is smooth, just like in those other pictures of Patty. And there's thicker hair on the backs of the thighs, so the gluteal folds. We have the cleft and we have folds here at the bottom of the cheeks, and then this is the back of the thighs, and the hair is much thicker on the thighs down here. That doesn't do anything for you guys, does it? So here's an illustration from an anatomical text of the perineum of the pelvic floor with the transparent showing the skeletal framework. And look at this. Tailbone, sphincter, external genitalia. Even, I didn't mention that there are, in fact, and I didn't really realize it, I saw this illustration as I was preparing the slide, and I went back to the drawer, and sure enough, there's a little high point right about there and there that indicates the position of the sits bones, the ischial tuberosities. I mean, it's not exactly, but again, we wouldn't expect it to be exactly. I mean, there's going to be individual variation, but there's also going to be interspecies variation. This is, again, it's not a human, but it's a biped with similar adaptations and with very convergent anatomy. Recently, somebody posted this online in a comment to one of my feeds, but this is amazing. I've always pointed out the biceps femoris tendon right there. See, if you reach down on the side of your knee, you can feel a real thick guitar string right there on the outside. Sometimes you can see it on individuals in photographs. I didn't have the time to elaborate, or take the time to elaborate. But I mean, the hamstrings, the quadriceps, people get all out of shape about, oh, there's a fold here, a crease between this diaper-like part of the costume that fits over the top of the thigh. Well, baloney, it's just a division here along the attachment of the gluteus maximus and separation from the vastus lateralis. I mean, the muscles are there. And the people who know the muscles and look at those muscles you know, the heads of the gastrocnemius, etc. I mean, it's there. It's just amazing. Again, as Janos said, the only way you could do that, they didn't have foam rubber back in 1967 of commercially available to the general public. You know, John Chambers was just experimenting with injected foam appliances that he used in Planet of the Apes and got an honorary Academy Award for his pioneering innovations in costume engineering. They didn't have four-way stretch fur. You couldn't have, you know, they didn't have Spanx. You couldn't pull on a form-fitting pair of exercise pants, you know, that you dyed brown-colored or whatever, or attached fur to. They had simple fur cloth that hung like pajamas, basically. All right, retention, the midfoot flexibility. So obviously, one of the significant features of the human foot is the lack of a divergent big toe or hallux. And the human adaptation has epitomized here this arch, where the weight is concentrated over the ball of the foot, passing forces through primarily the big toe, which is why it's so disproportionately bigger now than the greatly reduced and shortened lateral toes, and which primarily act for traction rather than propulsion. And the heel forms the other point of contact between that arch. The skeletal structure is really exactly the same. So when I talk about, I want to show you this because I want to talk about the mid-tarsal break. By break, we don't mean to damage something, we mean what? To flex, an axis of flexion. And that break in the foot occurs right across here. It actually involves two joints, that between the ankle, the talus, and the navicular, the bone just distal in front of it, and then the heel bone, the calcaneus, and the cuboid. So right across there, in the chin, and you can see this. Notice the talus has a very limited joint surface, the articular or joint surface. There's not a whole lot of movement potential, just a bit of a twisting movement of this bone relative to this one. But over here, look, this smooth surface here, this white surface, that's the extension of the articular surface up onto the neck of the ankle bone, so that this bone can ride all the way up. Well, imagine, it's not that bone riding up, but it's the talus, the ankle, tipping this direction relative to that image, to a much greater degree than what we see with the, and this is, the legacy of this is the grasp climbing adaptation of the apes to go up vertical supports, grasping onto the limb with a large muscular big toe opposite the long lateral digits. The foot has kind of a dual character in coordination. Forefoot is prehensile, it grips. The back hind foot is propulsive. It pushes the mass upward with leverage provided by the calf muscles and flexors of the digits. So Roger, unfortunately, in some ways, chose the cleanest, clearest, flattest right and left that he could find on that sandbar. And they're very fresh, made just moments earlier. And he pours the plaster and got these two casts that are remarkable, really. I mean, the clarity. The substrate on the sandbar wasn't kind of a granitic sand, like in a sandbox, a playground sandbox or something, but rather it was a very angular, eroded shale, so it held it locked together when compressed. And so the footprints held their shape for a very long time. There were investigators who came back months later, and you could still see the trail of footprints with the addition of other onlookers, rounded out, but they were there. Unfortunately, as a result of that, when presented to the scientific panels, what was the reaction? Well, these look like they were carved out of wooden planks. They're flat as a board. There's no feature, there's no topography, there's no arch, there's nothing that makes them look natural. Well, contraire, that was a very myopic perspective on it. Anyway, the model of the foot, which we're going to unpack here, was so apparent after investigating it for quite some time that I went out. I was encouraged by colleagues to go out on a limb, so to speak, and actually name the footprints. Now, Dr. Krantz had toyed with the idea that the footprint evidence was persuasive enough that it justified naming a new species on the basis of the footprints. Well, that's unprecedented. That's not conventional at all, and it never had been accepted. But what he didn't realize was you could name the footprints. There's a separate, what's called ichnotaxonomic system, a parallel set of classification for fossilized tracks and traces, for which the track maker is not yet identified. It provides a way to not only attach a name, but attach a differential diagnosis to designate what sets these tracks apart from others, so that they can be discussed and be compared and studied and things learned from them. Well, I bucked the convention by applying this nomen system to tracks that were not fossilized and have gotten all kinds of criticisms. One Pine, if you frequent ever the coalition, Facebook is one who has pontificated on this topic to great length. And but does he address the description or the taxon or the functional morphology described in the description? No. He's completely hung up on the technicality in his mind that I have no business giving a name to a potentially extant species. Of course, he doesn't believe Sasquatch exists, so that's just a pretense. But here's the name, but with the encouragement of many individuals, movers and shakers in the field of Bigfoot taxonomy, after presenting to a large subset of those practitioners at an international conference on Cenozoic tracks and traces, and having the subsequent manuscript reviewed by not 2, which was typical, but 5 reviewers, all who gave it a thumbs up, an enthusiastic thumbs up, it was published. And so we have now an official name for Sasquatch footprints and for Poidopes borealis, published in 2007. Now, for all the impact it's made today, but still, it was an accomplishment, it was. And why, again, why bother? Well, because, like I said, it allows for a diagnosis and description. So we can differentiate those characteristics that define the Sasquatch foot and differentiate it from other hominins or hominoids, like the great ape gorilla or the human here. All right, and what we see basically, just to summarize it, is an extension of trends that are evident when we look at an array of ever larger and more terrestrial species, from chimp to lowland gorilla to mountain gorilla. We see an increase in the length of the calcaneus. We see an increase in the breadth as the body mass increases. We see the lack of a longitudinal arch, no evolution of a longitudinal arch, even though the big toe has lost its divergence. But we can see a trend in that. Mountain gorillas have much less dexterity of the hallux than do a chimpanzee, and the relative size and proportion compared with the lateral digits. There's a decrease in length of the lateral digits. So it's not, one step, it's a couple steps removed, but I mean, it's the same trajectory that we see there. All right, so for example, at a recent event, what time is it? I know I'm probably going to run over. Okay, 5:30. So you're going to sort of put out the hook pretty soon? What's that? Okay, I'll try to bust through. I'll just highlight a couple things. At a recent event, this was from David Ellis, had been given these examples of footprints, and they're pretty long. I mean, this is a 16-inch track. He was trying to say this was a 16-inch track, and I said, no, it's not. And I took the ruler, and I measured it. It's barely about 13 and a half inches, and I smacked him with the ruler. I said, you can't measure out to here. You can't measure, way out to the very tip of the plaster. You got to take it at the deepest point, the flexion point, with the contact with the ground, and then measure out here to the terminus of the big toe, which is right about there. Anyway, but the point is, I said, all right, let's go back to my diagnosis. So what are the characteristics? Well, he's got this differential big toe, much bigger than the lateral toes. This one isn't too far off, but in many of the Sasquatch tracks, the lateral toes are larger. The little toe is pushed on its side. It's bent over, you can tell it's confined by shoe wear. There's a well-differentiated ball here and an arch, and a well-differentiated but narrow heel. So this is, I mean, a person with a feet this long, this is like 1/2 to maybe 1% of the population has feet that big. That's pretty rare. But nevertheless, it's a human. It's clearly a human footprint. And it makes it easy to see that. All right, mid-tarsal break. Lyle Laverty, timber cruiser for U.S. Forest Service, heard about the excitement about what happened in Bluff Creek while he was in Willow Creek with his timber cruising crew. Went out to the site. He goes, "We're camped not far from there," and he snapped off photographs. And this was one of them. It shows what I am convinced is a mid-tarsal break. So when the human steps, see, the whole foot comes up, and the point of fulcrum is here at the ball of the foot, whereas when the chimpanzee walks, the heel comes up first, and it flexes across the mid-tarsus. Okay, that's that joint here indicated with the red line. All right, here's that track that Bob Titmus cast, the one that was photographed by Lyle Laverty. Here's my interpretation. Am I confident in that? Absolutely, because I can watch the very dynamic I'm describing executed by the entity on the film. So here you can see it better in color perhaps. And also, whoops, watch the toes too on the foot. That lead foot right there. Boom, look at those long toes. Now, people like Rene de Hinden had characterized the Patterson-Gimlin film individuals having peas in a pod type of toes. Now here is, this has been compared. When I drew attention to this, one skeptic pointed to this. We did an episode for the Discovery, well, it was actually for National Geographic Channel, but here it's carried in the Discovery Times for some reason. But the National Geographic Channel hired an actor and had a fairly sophisticated costume with all the materials that were not available in 1967. But this could have been, it was a pair of really cheap loafers, something you'd buy, well, you probably couldn't even find them at the thrift store these days, but these really cheap leather loafers to which was glued with a glue gun a piece of fake fur and some phony toes sticking out like Ronald McDonald. And they did flop like Ronald McDonald. They didn't have the animation that is clearly evident as that foot swings forward, the toes dorsiflex under muscular contraction, and then slap down and engage with the soil. Not slap down, but flex as it engages with the soil there. And they're long. Now here you can see the heel coming up. Here the heel's vertical. The heel's vertical to the point that the rest of the foot would be projecting 8 inches into the ground. If that was a stiff prosthetic or a carved wooden foot, a foot stopper. Now here, this, as I said, the cast that was made by Roger was so clear and pristine. We've got this really lifelike outline of the foot. And the bulge you can see right there, the only explanation for that is the presence of the plantar, or the navicular tuberosity right there, which in the human foot is usually up in the air, in the arch. But if you see someone with flat feet, especially if they're pronated slightly because of a little overweight and knock knee, or their arches have collapsed, you'll see that bulge, and exactly like when they step out of the swimming pool onto the cement. Notice next time, you'll see that bulge right there. Oops, I'm not, that's right there. Looking at such a sharp angle. But I want you to look at this. I created this skeleton, then using landmarks like that, this little crease here, that indicates the flexion crease that shows where the joints at the ball of the foot are located. Created that outline, and then independently superimposed it on an image of the Titmus cast that shows the pressure ridge quite well. And sure enough, the reconstructed position, which is I'm quite confident because of that talar or navicular tuberosity in the talar-navicular joint, calcaneal cuboid joint, falls right there where it should, just slightly anterior to the pressure ridge. But also, look, all of this is toe. Doesn't that look like our image right there? Boom. And yet, see, when Rene de Hinden looked at these casts, he goes, look, they're just little peas in a pod. But the toe comes not just to here, the toe comes all the way back to this slight indentation right there. Well, actually, right there. So right there. All right, you can see it better in real topography. Well, if this is accurate, Jeff, why, or Dr. Meldrum, why does only one footprint show that? Well, here are the 10 casts that were made by Bob Titmus. Turning to the side, what do you see? Boom. They almost all have some expression of the pressure ridge. And it also accounts for the apparent disparity in the length of the imprints from toe to mid-tarsal pressure ridge is pretty consistent. The difference is in the degree to which the heel has been impressed. Have you ever seen people, that just have so much energy, they're bouncy and they walk with their heels kind of up in the air half the time? Well, they leave very slight heel imprints like this. But here it gets even better. I had the chance to look at the famous 1958 Jerry Crew footprint of one of the first documented Bigfoot tracks. By documented, I mean plaster cast actually made in the United States. And the original picture is kind of overexposed. You can see the strong shadow. I'm sure the newspaper photographer had one of those old-fashioned cameras with the big blue flash bulb. Boom. Well, I had a chance to look at the actual original cast, and what do you think you see when you turn it on its side? It has a pressure ridge, exactly like we might expect. Then I went to China. In China, they have the Yeren, the wild man. Its descriptions are very similar to Sasquatch, remarkably similar, just a higher incidence of the more reddish. This is bright orange. When I talked to a witness and he saw a picture like this, he goes, well, it's kind of like this, but not that red, he said. And he turned and he had just stained the door jamb of his house, and it was this deep, rusty brown color. He goes, that's what I saw. It was a deeper brown color. But anyway, kind of similar to what we see some of the renditions have had. I went over there. Mr. Yuan was a witness who worked at the Shenanjia Nature Reserve, and he had a sighting, very, very impactful, very interesting sighting, and had documented his sighting with a couple of footprint casts. They wouldn't let me see it until they had the camera set up for the interview. They wanted to catch my initial reaction to it, And so, but I handed Mr. Yuan the paper in which the ichnotaxonomy is described, which had this figure included. He saw that picture and, oh my gosh, he was thumping his finger. And I said, okay. And sure enough, we get there, get all set up, cameras rolling. He opens up his little case, and out comes the toweling and packing, and here are these 2 footprint casts, and lo and behold, they look just like the Patterson-Gimlin film side tracks, right down to the pressure ridge, in exactly the same position, the same slight offset angulation because of the offset of the tailor-navicular calcaneocuboid joint. And in fact, they even brought my attention because it's more pronounced, this double kind of arch, kind of McDonald's arch here that shows up because of the differential columns of the foot that include the tailor-navicular joint and the calcaneocuboid joint. So here's what's the smoking gun. Yes, this was cast in 1967, but to make a long story short, the first publication where the significance of this pressure ridge was described as a mechanical component of the Sasquatch foot wasn't published until 1999. But Mr. Yuan had his sighting cast this in 1995. Here's an example from the Blue Mountains near Mill Creek, 1991. Who's passing out the little black book with the instructions on how to fake the Sasquatch foot? So Dr. Meldrum's as yet undescribed theory will be incorporated. All right, we're just going to have to fly. So prognathtic face, here's that thing. Just let this sink in for a second. Not that I'm advocating the paranthropus. There's still, some challenges to that model, but it's not inconceivable that a robust type of Australopithecine made it out of Africa, spread across Asia, along the way achieved gigantism during the Pleistocene, as did so many other mammal groups, the Pleistocene megafauna, especially as they invaded northerly latitudes. That's where the giant woolly mammoths and muskox and rhinoceros and all the predators that went with those other large megafauna evolved. So it makes sense that a primate representative of that megafauna could be take the form of something like Gigantopithecus or a giant Paranthropus. But it's when you consider this in comparison to this bust. Oh, wrong way. Sorry. What happened? Oh, there it is. Okay. I lose my button. There we go. Point for point, all of the significant anatomical landmarks line up. Now, once again, this wasn't discovered until the 70s, wasn't described by graduate students, and the first dissertation that was focused on the biomechanics of this unexpectedly flat face combined with deep jaws didn't come out until the late 80s. So, how is it that Patty, instead of looking like what we might expect for a silver screen giant ape icon like King Kong, doesn't have a projecting face, but yet shows this unexpectedly derived morphology that only came into appreciation decades later, and so on. I'm going to jump ahead. All right, so we have Roger before the facade of the scientific community with their paradigm, which was largely dominated by the notion that there could only be one hominid species at a time. So there was no place to accommodate the evidence which he had to share. It was thought that evolution was like this, and it was reiterated in diagrams like this. I mean, false or erroneously interpreted as such. It wasn't the intent of the artist. He was just graphically depicting this succession through time, not a direct relationship. But it reinforced this notion. Now we know that it was a bushy tree with many branches, and there was a place to put. Over here, there's not. You know, it's just out here in limbo. So here's Professor Graybeard with the same evidence, but now we have this expanded understanding. We have this notion of a persistent multi-species hypothesis, which now frames accommodation for the Patterson-Gimlin film and all the evidence for the persistence of relic hominids. All right, so I better stop there. Thanks so much.
Jeff Meldrum. So there's hominids, there's hominoids, and there's hominerds. That's some detailed stuff. Thank you.